Chapter 1. Jake lay on his bed waiting for the stuff to kick in. He checked the clock. A little less than 40 minutes since dosing. Any second now. He laid back and focused on his music. It rose behind him, a sort of glittering shadow dancing with the beat, digging its hooks into his skull and dragging itself forward with great purpose. A gyrating, jittering thing with long arms and a million eyes. It reached out and plucked at the strings of a great spiderweb, tasting the steel-strong fibers with its fingers like some terrible butterfly. The flavors were the melodies, and the tones became colors on its glittering hide. A shiny tongue slithered from its throat and snatched up the tiny things that skittered through the undergrowth of Jake's thoughts, lifting them up and placing them on its back. A great ferry through the psychedelic jungle, carrying its passengers to some unknown place on the horizon. There was a wretched beauty to it, and Jake backed away from its presence. The being relented and dissolved back into a blood-red mass, quiet and soft, a warm source of life, a placenta which Jake allowed to swallow him too. The geometrics came next, and they flowed and twisted, breaking apart and blending back together. They seemed mindless, delirious and nonsensical, but he knew there was a method to the madness. Those shapes and colors were the words of a language, something ancient and universal, a manifestation of thought itself, source code. It tried to make sense of the cacophonies that danced with the music. Was that squiggle a lyric? That pocket of 8-dimensional cubes a representation of yesterday's math test? Nothing coherent presented itself, but at the same time he could tell exactly what everything meant. He opened his eyes, hoping for once he might experience some OEVs, but there were none. Everything just looked bright and vivid. Pretty, but not as exciting as the visions in the darkness. The light began to hurt, and the potion did its work on his physical body. He toppled off the bed and started retching into the garbage can. Vibrant flecks of orange and green splashed up the sides. After a few rounds, his stomach settled, and he slowly climbed back into bed, burrowing his way under the covers, safe from the mocking glow of that merciless light bulb. The feeling grew stronger this time, and the music became difficult to listen to. He paused it, but the silence was even worse. Little monsters shouted up at him from beneath, and he knew he had to tune them out, so he crammed the headphones back into his ears and played a different song. He wondered if 600 milligrams had been too much. Maybe so, but he knew he could handle it. He'd been through this dance before, and had always come out on the other side, not just unscathed, but often a little better for it. And the music still felt icky, so he pulled the headphones out again and focused on his breathing. He counted. 4 heartbeats in, hold for 4, 4 heartbeats out, hold for 4 more. That seemed to do the trick, and before long he was re-enveloped by the red velvet, and he tranced into some semblance of sleep. He woke a few hours later to a gentle knocking sound. He slowly lifted his head to see his stepfather standing in the open doorway. "Dinner's ready," he said. Jake rubbed his weary eyes and blinked, and his belly growled. "Awesome," he yawned. "I'll be right down." Tom smiled and shot him a thumbs up, retreating back down the hall. Jake swung his legs over the bed and stretched. He was about to get up and head to the kitchen when he spotted the garbage can at the corner of his eye, and the plastic lining still slick with vomit. A plump little fly crawled across the edge of the can, its iridescent shell gleaming under the light. Jake ignored the tiny creature, tied up the garbage sack, and picked up the whole can to take outside before heading to the kitchen. His mother was making tacos again. She always added too many onions and not enough chili powder, but they were far from inedible, especially in the soft afterglow of his trip. He plopped the chunky brown hamburger meat onto a tortilla, pretending not to listen to Tom and his mom discussing the political situation in some European country at the table behind him. Something about an invasion of some sort. Refugees, Jake guessed. His mother was saying that it was inhumane to refuse aid to people in need. Tom was saying that mixing cultures wasn't that simple, and that those people in need might not hold the same values and sense of morality as the countries they were being asked to take them in. His mother countered with something about families and minorities being in danger. Tom called that American leftist prescriptionism, which sounded made up. Jake successfully evaded the conversation, tossed a handful of cheese on his plate, and plopped himself in front of the TV. An old man was being interviewed about his latest book. He was rambling about the clear evidence of alien interference in human history. He challenged the idea that ancient peoples could possibly build such massive stone structures as the pyramids without help from outside forces, no matter how much time they had on their hands. Jake thought the man had a point. The program ended, and the flashing red, silver, and blue of the local news station spiraled across the screen. He took a bite of taco and wiped the dribbling mix of grease and hot sauce from his chin, fully intending to switch the channel until he heard the anchorman mention his hometown. Police in Farview are currently investigating a case of livestock mutilation. A local farmer awoke Saturday morning to find that one of his cows had gone missing. A few hours later, the animal's dismembered body was found in a nearby wooded area with cuts of meat removed, indicating that this was most likely an act of poaching. Locals are advised to report any suspicious activity to the authorities. Jake recognized the farm being shown on screen. It bordered the forest up the road where him and his friends would often go to smoke weed. He somehow doubted that poaching was still a thing that happened in this century. Then he remembered the man from the previous program, and the gears started turning. Cattle mutilation? The little green fucks may as well have erected a neon sign in the forest. Didn't take long for him to make up his mind to investigate. He texted Ken, who lived near the woods, to see if he might want to join him, but Kenneth didn't answer. Al probably would have come, but he was having dinner at his brother's house, so Jake was on his own. It would be no fun in the daylight, so he waited a couple hours until the sun had set. He grabbed his keys and paraphernalia and proceeded quietly down the hall, careful to step on the strong points where the floor wouldn't creak, doing the same on his way down the stairs and across the foyer. He reached the front door and slowly turned the deadbolt. It clicked softly, and he stepped past the threshold, set the door gently back into place, and locked it. The only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves and the hypnotic chittering of crickets. He slipped on his shoes and stepped into the night. Verks emerged into a wooded area not unlike the one he'd come from. Other than a slight breeze, the air felt the same. The types of plants and the feel of the ground under his feet were familiar, and the fading orange sunset was in the same place on the horizon. The moon looked the same, but the stars were a pale imitation of the bright and colorful splashes he was used to. All the star clouds were replaced by an inky blue monochrome, and half of the stars themselves seemed to have vanished from the sky entirely. He knew in the distance, outside of this little stretch of nature, there were great pools of red, orange, and yellow lights. He wondered if the humans on this side had somehow torn the stars from the heavens to light their cities and roads. He had known humans to have done worse things. He followed a well-worn path along the side of a hill toward the east. Last time, he had gone into the southern pastures where the humans kept their livestock. That cow had been so fat and healthy, it was almost a shame to have dumped so much of it into the undiscerning maws of his brood. But he had known at the time that there were at least a dozen more he could come back for. He realized now that, since no more than a week had passed since then, the animal's keeper would almost definitely be on alert. That kill had been too easy anyway. He could have sliced it with or without the mask on his worst day. There may have been a dozen cows, but in this secret place there lived a much more plentiful and far more desirable prey. Hundreds, thousands even. Those arrogant folk that ripped the stars from the skies. He went west, downhill into the trees and uphill again through an iron gate and into the town. He marveled at the streets, wide and black, branching and crisscrossing like the threads of a giant spiderweb. Along them stood great mansions, the smallest of which was at least threefold bigger than the ghoul's tiny shack. At the bays that connected these homes to the black streets were great wagons of iron and glass, whose wheels were hewn from some kind of black leather. Whatever massive beast whose hide that skin had been torn from, Verks could only imagine. The sun had finally fallen behind the far mountains in the west, but the lights in many of the people's homes were still burning. He crept along the side of the road, deep in the shadows. He focused through the lenses of the mask, peering into each house. There were so many rooms, filled with people, animals, and overflowing stores of feed for each of them. Seemed every other house had someone within who had been fattened to the point that Verks had to wonder if they were merely comfortable livestock. He doubted that. No, all that meat was wasted on the worms in this world. Inside most of these homes were children, dogs, and strong men. A few of the people had guns and stuffed animal heads hanging from the walls. Verks was too weary to deal with such obstacles, so he focused on one house across the street wherein was nothing but a pair of elderly folk. In their cupboards were no weapons, only dishes and many years' worth of useless knickknacks. They sat on a couch in front of a box that stood on a dresser. At first, Verks took it to be some kind of painting, but its face gave off a bright glow, and the pictures on it were moving. The elderly couple sat staring at the box, transfixed. Verks couldn't hear anything from where he stood outside their fence, but the pictures on the box were bright and clear. As he drew closer, even he became a little hypnotized by the story unfolding on the screen. He detached himself from the visions and found a post in the fence that he could climb without jangling the chains too much. Glancing around to make a mental note of all the dogs in the area, he crawled cautiously over the barrier and into the backyard. He made no sound, and nothing stirred. He inched across the grass and onto the stone of the back porch toward the thin mesh door that stood between him and his prey. Focusing through the eyes of the mask, he found that the lock was unlatched, welcoming him inside. His wings fluttered in excitement. He cursed the tittering noise they made, vowing that he would have the useless things removed someday soon. He quelled their chatter and breathed, reaching up for the door handle and slowly turning it. The couch inside creaked, and Verks froze. The male human had crossed his leg and put an arm around his mate, but it seemed Verks remained unnoticed. He clenched his jaw and pulled the door open slowly. It reached a point where the dry metal squeaked against itself, but the people remained undisturbed. Verks opened the door no further and slid sideways into the house, keeping the handle turned until the door fell gently back into frame. He sat there for several moments, watching and listening. The couple still didn't notice, enraptured by the sights and sounds of the false world in that box before them. Verks rose at last, sliding his knife from its sheath and positioning himself behind the male. His movement caught the attention of their silver foreechoes, and the woman's let out a silent scream. Verks quickly dispatched them both with two well-placed slashes to their necks. His appetite sharpened at the smell of blood, and a drop of bile rose up into his throat. He spat the acid on the carpet and stilled his movements. Standing over the meat, he rubbed his hands together in satisfaction. Now came the carving. He couldn't just drag the bodies into the woods. Though these humans were relatively small, the two of them combined would be far too heavy to cart all the way back to the portal, let alone all the way home. Besides, there were too many eyes in the houses around him. Were he to get caught, that would surely be the end of him. He held his meat pouch up to gauge its capacity. It was large, but not nearly large enough for two bodies. He scanned the house with his mask, spotting the room that was apparently devoted to cooking. There was a large can in the corner that was lined with a sack, and nearby was a roll of the same shiny dark material. He left the bodies in the box room and entered the kitchen to inspect. The material of the sacks was thin, but extremely stretchy and fairly tough. It would do. He returned to the box room where his new friends rested peacefully on the couch. There was a low table between their seat and the picture box. Verks pulled the table out of the way. The table jolted against the rough carpet, and a mug on top of it rocked, splooping a rich-smelling black liquid onto the mahogany. Verks stopped and inspected the stuff. It was coffee. Hours old by the looks of it. One of his tiny cousins floated in the cup, drowned by the enticing fluid. He removed the dead fly and flicked it away, swallowing the dregs for himself. That would help with the job to come. With the table out of the way, he grabbed the woman by the arm and tugged. She flopped off the couch and onto the floor, a sack of bones. He rolled her onto her back and straightened her out. He was about to cut off her clothes when he took a note of her size. Similar in frame to Sneerin. The pants only had a small spot of red on them, so he carefully removed them and placed them in his tool pouch as a present, then tore off the blood-stained shirt and cast it aside. He skinned the body and began cutting into the meat. One of the knees had a piece of metal in it, which struck Verks as both hilarious and mystifying. He wrapped it in a dry piece of torn shirt and tucked it into his pouch with the pants. He finished carving and sorting the cuts, then moved on to the male. He was larger and heavier than the other, bigger than Verks even, but the coffee was helping. He completed the task in a short time, and soon had more fatty red meat than Sneerin would know what to do with. He unwrapped one of the dark sacks, shook it open, and began packing. The meat was able to fit inside 2 of them with enough room to tie off the handles for carrying. He tested the weight and decided he could come back for the bones if he felt up to it. Before leaving, he caught another whiff of coffee and followed it into the kitchen. There was a massive can full of the stuff, more than he'd ever seen in one place. He tossed it into a 3rd sack. That much could buy him all the food of the market if push came to shove. He hoisted the 3 bags and made his way out of the house, over the fence and across the street back into the forest. He descended into the woods, careful not to snag the paper-thin bags in any branches as he went. The going was a little tough, and he stumbled once on a steep incline before a stream, but the mask warned him of the fall, and he was able to brace himself. He leapt over the trickling waters, crawled up the opposite bank, and continued forth. About 3/4 of the way, the mask revealed the soft glow of a large animal a short distance off the path to his left. He thought it was nothing more than a slumbering deer, until he realized that the glowing body was perched high up on a platform set into the branches of a tree. He froze and watched as the figure raised one of its limbs and emitted a second, tiny, brighter light, a small flame. The flame was extinguished and replaced by a dimmer one which Verks recognized as the ember of a pipe. This was a person, a watchdog no doubt, perched above the ground in order to surprise an unwelcome interloper like himself. They hadn't noticed him yet, so he kept following his 4 echoes, which were now tiptoeing gently through the underbrush. He saw it moments before it happened. He took a misstep and a dry twig snapped underfoot. The human's gaze was drawn to him. Slowly and unconcerned at first, but he could see the heart within its body begin to pulse more quickly. The human reached into its pocket and pulled out a small wafer from which erupted a blinding white light. The light fell on Verks, and the human let out a horrified squeal. Verks took no time to dwell, breaking into a loud and clumsy run towards the gateway. One of the black bags became snagged on a drooping branch and tore. Verks paused for half a second to inspect the hole. It was fine. Over his shoulder, the figure of the human was scrambling down from its perch. Why was it chasing him? Even the mask seemed confused. The human's echoes were scattered and dissonant, jittering about in all directions. Some froze in place, some climbed back up into the tree or ran in the opposite direction. Others stopped and started, running in circles or hiding in odd places. One fell to its knees and covered its head as if the earth beneath were shaking. But the flesh and blood human seemed unconcerned with any of these potentialities. Still wielding the magic wafer, it leapt from the trunk and darted after Verks, the searing white rays lighting its pursuit. Verks looked away, blinded by a swarm of Stygian dots where the light had struck his eyes. He scrambled forward, feeling his way through the trees using his one free hand. The path back to the gateway was just ahead. He broke out onto the bare hill and crawled up it, his vision nearly restored. He scrambled to his feet and ran along the hillside, the patter of his pursuer's shoes echoing in his ears. He reached the spot and dove off the path, crawling to hide behind a fallen log. The human stopped on the path above, looking into the grove, light swinging left to right, frantically searching for the ghoul. Finally, the light landed on Verks, and he heard the scuffing sound of the human descending the incline toward him. The ghoul leapt from his hiding spot. He could have turned and brandished his knife, stabbing his wretched pursuer in the gut and earned himself a 3rd sack of meat, but he didn't dare confront the carrier of that magic light. Even if he could see past the blinding glow, it might shoot lightning or fire some toxic mist at him. So he ran away toward the safety of those ripples in the air. The human lunged at him. Verks felt the human's fingers wrap around his ankle, and they were both pulled through the gateway. Verks slashed at the boy's wrist and kicked the foolish creature away, rising to his feet. The The human looked up at him with bewildered, bloodshot eyes. It glanced around at its new surroundings, uncomprehending, then back up at the ghoul. Verks brandished his knife. The human saw the blade and scrambled backward, its rear scraping the dirty groove in the detritus. It backed itself up against a rock and shielded its face. Verks raised his arm to strike the pitiful creature when he saw its chest begin to heave. It let out a series of hiccups, rolled over onto all fours, and vomited all over itself. Verks noticed something shining under the leaves nearby, the glowing device the human had used to blind him. He kicked the human hard in the ribs, causing it to cry out in pain and topple face first into its own muddy puke. While it groaned, Verks leapt for the device and pocketed it. He considered again if he should just kill the boy now and come back for the carcass, but he felt kind of pity watching it roll dumbly in its own spat. He picked up his bags and kicked the human several more times, ensuring that none of its echoes would rise before he made his departure. Satisfied and heavy with bounty, the ghoul ran off again toward home. Jake lay there for what felt like centuries. Finally, the stench of his vomit overpowered the fear, and he slowly sat up. He tried to wipe the puke from his face, but only succeeded in spreading the acidic sludge onto his hand. Some of it dribbled down his arm, and he felt a terrible burning. He winced and looked down to see a deep gash in the side of his forearm. It wasn't very wide, but it was deep, and literally pouring blood. He let out an involuntary gasp, certain that something inside had torn. There was no way a cut that deep hadn't severed a nerve or worse. He steadied his breathing to quiet the panic and tried to flex his fingers. It hurt a little bit, but they moved like normal. He braced his right hand against the rock beside him and tried to push his trembling body to its feet. A second pain erupted across his ribs, forcing him to collapse back on the ground with a yelp. Why hadn't he run away? Every fiber of his being had screamed at him not to follow that thing. What the fuck could have possessed him to chase after it? He'd even tried to grab it. Now he was sitting in a pool of his own vomit, broken and bleeding. Nothing mortal, but clearly the consequences of stupidity. He looked around for something. He wasn't sure what that something was, but he still managed to find it nearby, a crooked branch lying among the leaves. He reached for it, trying his best to ignore the vicious throbbing in his side. Using the stick, he hoisted himself up onto his feet. His legs felt fine, but his body screamed at him with every movement. Weed would help. He rested the top of the stick into the armpit of his good side and rummaged through his pocket. Something sharp and slimy nicked his finger. He recoiled, then slowly reinserted his hand, pulling out a sticky pile of broken glass and dank resin. He grimaced and solemnly dropped the shattered bits of pipe onto the ground. At least he'd gotten a few good hits before the creature appeared. If he hadn't, he might literally be dying from the pain. He grabbed hold of the stick once again and lifted his shoulder off of it. It would be best if he could use it to support his left side, but that kind of exertion couldn't be good for the wound in his arm. He pressed that arm tightly against his chest to slow the bleeding, then took a tentative step forward. It was sheer agony at first, but the endorphins kicked in pretty quick. The night was dark without his phone to light the way, so he had to use the stick like a blind man's cane to avoid tripping. He wanted to get back to the stream to wash himself off, but he only had a vague idea of which way to go. He didn't recognize this part of the forest at all. Considering just how much time he spent down here, that just wasn't possible. Had to be something about the darkness. Combined with the drugs in his system, the shock of what had just happened, and the incredible pain he was in, he was just disoriented, right? It didn't take long to realize that wasn't the case. It was the stars that really gave it away. There were more of them, thousands more, and colors. He'd never known that there were supposed to be colors in the night sky. But there weren't supposed to be colors in the stars. Not where he came from. There was supposed to be the gentle sound of a creek nearby, and there was supposed to be a hill with a path running along its side right where he was standing. There were supposed to be distant city lights in the valley, and the glow of neighborhood houses only a few hundred feet away. But there was none of that. No sign of anything familiar. He decided to find some high ground. He pushed himself through the pain and found his way to the top of a hill. This place was definitely not his home. He'd been somehow transported to another world, another time even. He spotted the little clearing he'd come from. If he wanted to get back, that clearing would be his best bet. He thought about going back down to it, but decided he would be much safer up here for the time being. That thing might come back at any moment to finish the job, and God only knew what else was lurking out there in the darkness. He sat down and pulled out his lighter, realizing only then that he could have been using it to help him navigate through the forest this whole time. He shrugged it off. He had to do something about the gash in his arm. He struck the flint and tried to cauterize the wound with the flame. The pain doubled. The hairs on his arm curled up and turned to dust, and the blood looked like maybe it dried out a little, but the wound still gaped at him like the mouth of a corpse. He cried out in frustration, then immediately regretted it. Something canine howled in the distance, and his blood went cold. The thought of all those unseen things among the trees came surging back to him, and his heart began to race. He got up and looked around for some place better to hide. And then he sat back down again, curling up and trying to make himself really small. That would do no good. He got back up again and began to walk aimlessly toward the south. He realized that he had no idea what he was doing and stopped. The world began to swim around him. Little dark things in the bushes taunted him. Something fluttered nearby and he jumped. He stood there like a statue for what felt like forever, and then he heard something creeping through the shrubs beside him. He broke into a run. It was coming. First on his left, now on his right. Soon directly behind him, keeping pace with his limping jog. His ears began to ring, and those colors in the sky started to reach down for him like dripping paint. He tripped over a rock and went sprawling. The pain in his body erupted afresh. "Did you forget?" it berated him. Now, on top of everything else, his muscles were sore and hot. He wanted to cry out again, but the fear was so real that it shoved the sound back down into his throat before he could even think of escaping. He collapsed into the prickly grass and lay there, feeling the gentle throb in his arm as it struggled to heal itself. His ribs were still aching, but the adrenaline had taken some of the edge off. He was overcome by a sort of dizzy euphoria which made it easier to simply lay there on the ground. Maybe he could just wait until morning, cradled here by the soft earth. His heartbeat slowed, and the peaceful silence hypnotized him into a sort of half-sleep. He lay there unthinking. If anything came, he could run again. He could always run. Many moments passed, and eventually something did come. He heard a soft buzzing sound nearby, like a fly, but louder and heavier. It neared his face, and he swatted it away, feeling the side of his hand slap against something tiny and warm. The tiny creature let out an equally tiny squeal. Jake opened his eyes and pushed himself away from the sound. In front of him hovered some kind of hallucination. It was a little person, no bigger than a finger, wearing a sharp brown vest and shorts. It hovered there, swaying side to side in a slight daze, its translucent wings a frantic blur on its back. It finally steadied itself and flew slowly in Jake's direction, hands raised in a show of peaceful intent. It had glowing rows of bracelets around each forearm. "What the fuck?" Jake whispered. The creature opened its mouth and made a noise. Jake thought it was a whistle at first, but as the creature drew closer, he realized that it was speaking some kind of language. Overcome by curiosity, Jake allowed it to get very close to his face. It said something in his ear. Jake stood very still, not sure what to make of the little person. It chittered again. They were definitely words coming from its mouth, but Jake understood none of it. He looked sideways at the thing hovering by his face. Finally, it flew down and landed on his belly. It held up its hands again, pumping them back and forth. Jake understood that to mean, "Hang on a sec." From its tidy vest, the creature withdrew a small book and began leafing through it. The search seemed to take longer than the tiny creature had anticipated, and it plopped itself down, cross-legged on his chest. After a few moments, the creature found what it was looking for and placed the book on its lap. From its belt, it unhooked some kind of tiny horn. It raised the horn to its lips and spoke. "Are you hurt?" it said. "What?" The creature pointed at Jake's bleeding arm with his free hand. "Hurt," it insisted. "Are you hurt?" The way it spoke, it sounded like a child. Jake finally understood. "Hurt?" "Yes, hurt." Jake felt an unexpected wave of relief come over him. "Yes, I'm hurt bad," he said. To drive the point home, he added, "Ouch," and made a face. The creature nodded matter-of-factly. It began leafing through the pages of its book again, then said, "Are you from here?" "I'm not from here." "Not from here," it repeated. It turned a page in its book and looked back up at Jake. "What am I?" Jake shook his head. That's what I was going to ask. The creature looked up and nodded to itself, apparently translating Jake's statement in its head. Then it glanced back down in the book and back up at Jake.
We will help you, it said. You will wait here. You will be safe.
The creature stood and returned the book to the pocket in its tiny vest.
Understand?
Jake nodded.
Repeat.
I will wait here.
Repeat more.
I will be safe. You will help me. The fuzzy thing smiled at Jake, reaching up to tug on one of its elbowed antennae as if tipping its hat.
I will come back with help.
Its wings became a blur, and it rose off of Jake's belly, darting away until it was nothing but a glowing speck fading in the darkness. Jake flopped his head back into the grass and sighed. He had no idea what was going on, but he decided to trust the creature. He felt safe now. He thought about the monster. Of course it had attacked him. He'd chased it after all. Whatever it had been doing in the woods, it had no business with him. It had looked frightening, but he knew that didn't mean anything. That creature had wounded Jake, sure, but not before trying to run. It had probably been more frightened of him than he was of it. He felt a little guilty. And the sound of buzzing soon returned. It sounded like a swarm of giant bees, and for a moment the fear returned with it. He saw a little cloud of glowing lights emerge from the trees at the bottom of the hill and relaxed. He propped himself up onto his right elbow as they approached. He saw that they were followed by a handful of cat-sized, ghostly pale creatures carrying leather pouches. And they had antennae as well, but no wings. Jake had the delirious thought that they might be the adults, and the bee people were their children, but as they reached the spot on the hill where he lay, he could see that they must be different species. In fact, the pale things looked more like the creature that had sliced and kicked him than their fuzzy, winged companions. One of the little flyers, different from the first one, he didn't see that one anywhere, landed gracefully on his chest and raised a hand in greeting. She removed the horn from her belt and spoke.
What is your name?
She asked. It was immediately clear that she had practiced her English a bit more than the baby talker, but her voice was still adorably tiny. Tom, he lied.
The name is Tom?
He nodded. Yes.
What happened to you, Tom?
Something attacked me, he started. I grabbed this thing and it attacked me.
What was it?
I don't know. He thought for a moment. It was my size, a little bigger. It was wearing a mask and carrying garbage bags. At the sound of the word mask, the creature gave a meaningful look to one of her associates, who jotted something down in a tiny book. She returned her gaze to Jake.
We will heal your arm, Tom, okay?
He nodded again. That would be great. She turned to one of her companions and raised her glowing arms, waving them around in the air to create a series of swooping patterns. The companion turned to one of the pouch carriers in the grass nearby and made his own series of movements. The small behemoth trudged forward with his leather pouch and began pouring pure alcohol on Jake's wound. His arms seethed with pain, but he clenched his jaw and held still. Commanded by the little flying people, the pale thing stepped out of the way, and a second one applied a sticky, viscous fluid. It smelled like honey. Finally, a pair of the flyers used a thin, glossy thread to stitch the wound shut. When they had finished, the female on Jake's chest raised the horn to her lips once more.
Where is home, Tom?
She asked. He glanced in the direction where his house was supposed to be. I come from somewhere else.
Do you know what I am?
He shook his head. I still don't know what you are. Her stenographer jotted more notes in his book.
Tom, said the little woman, you come from Earth, do you?
Yes, I'm from Earth. Jake's head swam a little. Where is this place? Am I on another planet?
No, the woman cooed. No, this is Earth. It is the night.
I come out here at night all the time. The creature's manicured accent wavered.
It is a different night.
Jake rose slightly, making the tiny woman lose her footing. She gasped and fell on her butt. What's going on? He said. Where am I?
Do not be afraid, human, the woman shouted. I am tiny and you're big.
Jake's heart started pounding. The little woman flew up into the air to escape the seismic movements. A wise decision on her part. As soon as she was a foot above him, he pushed himself back and scrambled to his feet.
Stop, Tom,
the lady cried through her horn. But Jake paid her no attention. He hauled ass down the hill toward the clearing where he had first entered this strange place. He found some trouble scrambling through the greenery, but was still many times faster than his tiny pursuers. He broke through the trees into the clearing and looked around. Was it that side or this one? In his panic, he couldn't really remember. He looked around for the boulder where the creature had attacked him. He finally saw it to the right near some thorny bushes. His aching ribs told him to calm the fuck down, but he pressed on. He heard a noise behind him, branches breaking and twigs snapping as something large ran through the undergrowth in his direction. He made the mistake of turning to look at the most fucked up dog he'd ever seen emerging from the forest behind him. Its body was way too goddamn long, with jet black fur, a wide snout, and knotted ears like a pit. He felt the adrenaline surge through his body. He forgot the pain entirely and broke into a sprint as the dog pursued, barking and growling, teeth gnashing at his heels. He dove at the spot and swiveled around as the dog approached. It was almost upon him. Like a baby, he closed his eyes and wished he was home in bed, knowing that he was about to be devoured by this hellhound. But he wasn't devoured. A weird silence fell around him, and he felt his stomach flipping around 7 or 8 times. He opened his eyes slowly to see the familiar glow of a nearby house beyond the branches overhead. He scrambled to his feet and turned around to look at the place where he'd sat. It was an unremarkable spot under a tree in a thicket. No vomit, no boulder, no too long dog. It was a place he had been a million times before. He let himself relax and a few tears trickled down his cheeks. He knew that sooner or later a shadow would emerge from that spot. Surely his pursuers would know about the portal and would be coming for him. And so, after gathering a bit of mental strength, he crawled out of the undergrowth and jogged as fast as his battered ribs would allow toward the first place that came to his mind.